Welcome. My name is Holly. I'm a manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates, and I am sitting in front of Annie Oakley's tent. I'll back up so you can see her, and you'll see that slide later on as well. Let's get started with the story of Annie Oakley. Annie Oakley was born Phoebe Ann on August 13th, 1860, in Darke County, Ohio. That's near the Indiana border. And she was the daughter of Susan Wise Moses and Jacob Moses. And later on, I'll tell you that there were all kinds of variations written on that name. So we're not even sure if that was the correct name. Annie was six of nine children. Her father was 61 years old when she was born. He became disabled when he had hypothermia during a blizzard in 1865. He died of pneumonia the following year, and her mother later remarried Daniel Broombaugh and had another daughter and was widowed once again, and eventually she'll marry a third time. On March 15th, 1870, at age 9 or 10, Annie was admitted to the Darke County Infirmary, along with her sister Sarah Ellen. She was placed under the care of the infirmary's superintendent, Samuel Crawford Eddington, and his wife, Nancy. And Nancy taught her to sew. And she was there for several weeks. And it seemed like as well as it could go at a place like this, it went well. And let me explain what this building is. I don't know if it's still there today. My guess would be it is not, but I have to be honest, I didn't research that part. It was one of the many 19th century Ohio poorhouses that took care of the destitute or just their children, mentally ill, and elderly residents referred to as paupers in the registrar. Sometimes parents under financial burdens would send their children to places like this. 8-year-old Ohioan Annie Oakley, this is on the postcard, was sent to this infirmary by her widowed mother and lived there for 2 years in the 1860s until she was hired out by a family to do chores. And that's actually where it came from, their website. Of all the people I've ever done research on, Annie Oakley has the most contradictions in her story because they said 2 years, and then she goes to live with this other family, equivalent of a foster family. Other places say a few weeks. Some places don't even mention the poorhouse. There's confusion around the last name, if it's Moses, Mozzie, so many things. Well, whatever had happened, she was this part I know is true. She was loaned out to a local family to care for their baby with the promise of 50 cents a week and education. They originally wanted someone who could pump water and cook and who was bigger, because Annie was very petite. She spent about 2 years in near bondage to them. One time, Annie was put out in the freezing cold without shoes to punish her because she'd fallen asleep over some mending. Annie called them the wolves. And after 2 years, Annie was able to escape to a nearby train station. And when she told the person on the train she only had something like 40 cents, he paid her fare back home. She was briefly reunited with her mother, but because of her desperate financial situation, her mother was forced to send Annie back to the county poorhouse. But Annie had a talent. While her sisters played with dolls, Annie went with her father when she was quite young, because remember, he passed away when she was quite young, as he hunted and trapped in the woods. From an early age, Annie showed an amazing talent for marksmanship. I was 8 years old when I made my first shot, she said, and I still consider it one of the best shots I ever made. Bracing her father's old muzzle loader on a porch rail, that wasn't easy to shoot with. She picked off a squirrel sitting on a fence in her front yard with a shot to the head, which allowed its meat to be preserved. And by the way, her mother never liked her using weapons. That scared her. But other than hunting, Annie never used weapons against any human being, for violence or anything like that. Annie worked at the poorhouse for roughly 3 years and returned home to her mother when she was in her mid-teens. Her shooting not only put food on the table, but it eventually allowed her mother to pay off the $200 mortgage on the home, thanks to the money Annie earned by selling the game she hunted to a local grocery store that supplied hotels and restaurants in Cincinnati. And there she is as a teen. And she's very petite, I think 5 feet tall and 100 to 110 pounds, depending on which version of her story you read. And then she meets somebody. So this is like a poster, people that went on the road to vaudeville. Graham and Butler, rifle team, all around shots. They did all kinds of tricks and shooting. A Cincinnati hotel keeper who knew of Annie's reputation arranged a shooting contest between 15-year-old Annie and a traveling professional sharpshooter named Frank Butler. And I think she's actually 16 by the time they meet up. Again, there's so many variations. And yes, history is kind of fluid and you uncover new things. But truly, this was the most difficult one to winnow through and find as close to the truth and try to be accurate as possible. Butler regularly challenged sharpshooters when he toured the country. Butler, who chuckled when he first saw Annie, and I'm going to think that she's 16, he's 10 years older, so 26. And he hit 24 out of his 25 targets. Annie hit 25 out of 25. And after winning the shooting match, Annie goes on to win Butler's heart. And supposedly they married the following summer. Now, there's a couple thoughts about this. So this is what I want to tell you. It says they're married a year later, but a marriage certificate at the Archives of Ontario states that they were married June 20th, 1882 in Windsor, Ontario. Some sources say the marriage took place on August 23rd, 1876, but there's no record that corroborates that. On the other hand, they think that maybe it just got put out there and that he actually made a record because she was so young when he married her. She was 16. And other people say that never could have happened because he was still married to his first wife. And sometimes they did make Annie younger than she was. So I don't have an exact answer on that one. For the next few years, Frank toured with his male partner, performing feats of marksmanship on the stage. But when his partner came sick in May of 1882, and Annie had been traveling with him this time, doing errands, helping gather things, etc., Annie replaced him. Isn't it amazing for all that time she hadn't been actually sharpshooting? Annie replaced him, and she won instant praise for her shooting skills. Called Annie by her sisters, that wasn't her name. Remember, it was Phoebe Ann. She took also the stage name Oakley, and they think that's based on a nearby location in Cincinnati, but we really don't know, just like we really don't know exactly how her last name was originally spelled. I don't want to move because I don't want to sit here on Frank Butler's head. Annie quickly joined the vaudeville circuit, which is going from place to place. Different performances, sometimes there would be other performers joining them, making her own costumes. As the headliner of the show, she did not want her costumes to detract from her skills in marksmanship. In March of 1884, she met Sitting Bull, the Lakota Sioux leader who defeated General Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. He gave her the name Watanya Cecilia, or Little Sure Shot, after seeing her perform in St. Paul, Minnesota. Then they went on to travel with the Sells Brothers Circuits for a year. Butler and Oakley joined the Buffalo Bills Wild West show in 1885. And these shows, I think you could say they are like a fantasy and designed to kind of portray the home life in the West in a romanticized version. But it also, there's some problematic things about the way they reference American Indians. And plus Buffalo Bill, before he started the show, he had gone out west. You know how he got his nickname, Buffalo Bill? Because he went out and he decimated the buffalo. They never recovered from that. And then he went in search of revenge for Little Bighorn. I won't comment on what I think as far as Custer there, but revenge on that, and he actually ended up getting someone's scalp. Now, I'm not doing this on Buffalo Bill, though that would be tempting in the future. But in later years, he regrets what he did with the scalp, with the buffalo. But by then it's too late. Just to give you a kind of idea, maybe someday I'll talk about him. So, anyways, they joined the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. The couple performed as partners. This is 1885, but Oakley became the star. And Butler supported his wife by becoming her assistant and manager. She would shoot glass balls out of the air, shoot through playing cards she riddled before it touched the ground, and would shoot the ash off the cigarette out of Frank's mouth. And you have to really believe in somebody to let them do that to you. I want you to think about this. Women during that time, eventually there's other sharpshooters and there's Western people, women that become known like Calamity Jane. But Annie was the first, and in my opinion, Annie was the best. And there the two of them are together. And this is supposed to be a picture from 1884. And as I told you before, it is difficult to separate truth from fiction when it comes to Annie Oakley. Some myths live on today, thanks to the 1946 Broadway musical, Annie, Get Your Gun. And I am going to talk to you a little bit about that, if you will indulge me to stay around to the end, who in the final scene portrays Annie losing a match deliberately to protect her future husband's ego when she won his heart by beating him in a shootout. I want you to think about this. Annie took pride in her being a sharpshooter, a sure shot, a marksman. Would she have ever actually deliberately lost a match? That never happened, not even with Frank Butler. But remember, this is a musical that is going to be very loosely based on her life. And by the way, that is redone in 1950. It becomes a movie. And I find some things, I love musicals, but there are some problematic things about them. But it's redone and redone. I'll talk more about that later. But she was the star attraction of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, a popular act in the 19th century known for its romanticized portrayal of frontier life. And she demonstrated her talents on stages around the world on and off through this show for 16 years. And there she is, and she's going to shoot an object by using that mirror. I can't imagine the skill that took. And this is about 1885. There's Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull. Annie and Frank were in Minnesota in 1884, and you knew that. And Sitting Bull was there to see their show. And Sitting Bull was so impressed by her skills. I'm referring to this again because I didn't tell this part before, that he sent $65 to her hotel just to take a photograph with her. That's on the American Experience on PBS. They have a documentary about her. Oakley sent the money back and said that he would call her the next day. Could call her the next day. Their initial meeting was the start of their friendship, and you know his nickname, Watanya Cecilia, which means little sure shot. And I'll tell you why he gave her that name, beyond being a sure shot and being petite. In 1885, Sitting Bull started touring with Buffalo Bill's Cody's Wild West show along with Annie Oakley. He was part of the opening procession and was paid $50 a week. He was also able to make more money by selling his autographs for $1 each. Now remember, we're talking about a time after Little Bighorn here. And according to Annie, Sitting Bull insisted on adopting her as her daughter, though not officially. He had asked me to take the place of the daughter he lost shortly after the Custer massacre, Oakley said. And I find it really strange that they actually, Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull actually had their picture taken together. There's not one of Annie and Sitting Bull together, unfortunately. So to signify the unofficial adoption, Sitting Bull gave Oakley the moccasins, which were made by his daughter, that he wore during the Battle of Little Bighorn. Oakley thought highly of the Lakota leader, and I don't know what happened to those. He fought justly for his people who had been driven from their God-given inheritance or were living upon broken promises. So you can see what Annie thought of that. She said, Sitting Bull's daughter was close in age to Oakley, and he treated her as his own. He is a dear, faithful old friend, and I have great respect and affection for him, Annie said of her relationship with Sitting Bull. And apparently he gave his daughter the same nickname that he had for Annie, which was Tanya Cecilia, and I hope I said that right, so that he paid her the highest compliment. Appearing in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in the 80s and 90s made her as well known as any famous actress today, or probably the most celebrated female performer in the world, according to author Larry McMurtry, and he was the gentleman that wrote Lonesome Dove, among other things. And that refers to her as Little Sure Shot. And this is a picture of Buffalo Bill's Wild West traveling show. And by the way, Sitting Bull, he only lasts for 1 year. And he was in the procession, the opening procession, and that's it. Now there are other American Indians in here in the show. I don't always approve of I don't think they were always portrayed in the best possible light. But I digressed. So I just want to point out that if you go up here, 1, 2, 3, Annie is the one with the side profile there. That is Annie Oakley. And those are the performers in the show. And there's the picture that I'm in front of where I blocked the beautiful Annie Oakley. I should have planned that better. And this is her in front of her tent in 1889. And that's the picture from the Library of Congress. I just want to mention something to you. Annie, and there's some great papers and writing. This young woman she won the contest at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. And I do put her in the sources I use, but she said she's born in 1860. She died in 1926, and she lived through 3 wars and great social changes within the United States. Women at the time in the Victorian era, they lived in a world of firm boundaries and expectations, sometimes known as the cult of true womanhood, which is connected to the ideology that men and women dwell within distinctly separate spheres within society. Men at that time believed were more fit for the workplace and the public eye, while women were fit for domestic settings. Most women who worked outside of the home were either factory workers, and they made a lot less than women. I mean, this is something that they're still working on today. So, and women had their defined roles at that time. Women stayed with women, men associated with men, and there's strict rules and etiquette to obey if one wanted to be accepted in society. And that is what Annie is walking through life in a time period where it's changing. Those roles are beginning to change because women's suffrage would come along. She said when she started, it was a prejudice that she had to live down. It was not considered proper for a lady to compete in a man's sport. How she managed that balance, according to this person that wrote this, is the key word, lady. And based on what I have read as well, she maintained the personality that society thought a woman should have. She was graceful, modest, sweet, clever, and acted as a civilizing force to the men who she was always with in the traveling show. And she was respected in both spheres of society. And she pushed the boundaries of that by showing that a woman could be skilled with a gun and a horse. There's pictures of her riding side saddle and shooting from her horse. People flock to it, except to see a loudmouthed, brassy woman. But, well, you can think about that when you realize the first person that portrayed her was Ethel Merman, but her family didn't approve of her being in a show because of the negative stereotypes that are associated with it. And she was able to make A woman shooting acceptable in Victorian society. There's really a great book. See if I can get this up here. It's called The Life and Legacy of Annie Oakley, and you can't see it anymore. That's my fault. But it's by Glenda Riley. It's probably the most current book. A lot of things are out of print. And here we go. Right there. So I will tell you honestly, Annie made her own costumes. She wasn't against being feminine because she would wear leggings under her dress, make her own leggings. That made her look very feminine, but they weren't flashy and they weren't anything that anybody could ever disparage by the way she looked. But it did accent her appearance because she was a very skilled seamstress as well. Um, there was never any evidence that Annie supported voting for women, but I also often wonder, because of the restrictions as time was changing, that she didn't feel that she could take that stance because she had already broken so many barriers, which is a shame, and I wish she could have. But that's what I get from it so far. So yes, I think she definitely was radical for her time, but won acceptance from both spheres of society, women that are moving away from those non-traditional roles. Suffragettes is what they used to call them, but we'll talk about women's suffrage, and those that still believed in the traditional role. She had a hard road to walk. She lived through 3 wars. I mean, she had to support her family and got sent away twice when she was a child. I really do think she's an amazing woman. And as I'm going to talk about this, I'll tell you, I am going to tie her into Thomas Edison, which I find exciting because that's where I work. But what I will also say is that when I was young, I used to read biographies. You know, our library had these, shout out to Sanbornville, New Hampshire, Gaffney Library, by the way. And I spent a lot of time there and I volunteered and I read everything. But I particularly like the biographies of women. One of them is the story of Annie Oakley. I think it kind of had an orange cover with her red writing, and her story was, I found all those women's stories inspirational. So I feel like there's lots of good reasons to talk to you about her, though I think she's probably more forgotten today. But her career really took off being in the Buffalo Bills show. Queen Victoria and they go to Europe, they go to London, and Queen Victoria calls her a very clever little girl. I'll let you think about the wording of that. And though another very successful, a rivalry with a sharpshooter, Lillian Smith, led to Oakley's exit from the show at the end of the London engagement. She did not like Smith. Smith claimed to be substantially younger than her. I'm not sure if that's true or not true. And Annie joined a rival Wild West show for a while. Lillian leaves the show, and Annie rejoined Cody for 3 more years. They began with the 1889 Paris Exposition, which was a world-renowned event. By the time it ended, Annie was America's first female superstar. And I'm not overstating that. But this is something I also want you to know about her, as she's a very mixed person in a time of transition. She never forgot how poor she grew up. She stated I made a great deal of money in my time, but I never believed in wasting a dollar of it. I mean, she didn't end up with a ton of money in the bank, considering how, she worked very hard. Oakley and Butler gave money to charities for orphans and helped support her mother and his daughters. And I'm sure she helped out her sisters too. She earned more than any other performer in the show, except for Cody, who owned the show himself. But she continued to supplement her income with side shooting competitions. I mean, she had grown up so poor, and she had a lot of obligations. And yes, Butler had 2 daughters. They never had children together. And I don't know, people didn't talk about those things back then. So I don't know if that was a personal choice or that she was not able to have children. But either way, they stayed in touch with his daughters. And these cards like this are called cabinet cards, and it says that she's standing with an L.C. Smith shotgun in her right hand, plus a Stevens Lord single shot pistol, as well as a Smith & Wesson new Model 3 target revolver, both with pearl grips and engraved and gold plated, sitting at her feet in this picture. And I know, and there's her outfit that she made, and there's her leggings there. And I will tell you that I am not very learned about old weapons, but I really quite in awe of Annie Oakley and what she accomplished within the boundaries of society. In 1894, Annie came to Thomas Edison's Black Maria studio, which had tar paper around it and could rotate. In West Orange, New Jersey, Edison wanted to see if his kinetograph, and I'm going to show you in a minute, a primitive version of a movie camera was sensitive enough to capture the smoke from Oakley's gun. So let me try and play this for you. Now you're going to see, I took this from the Library of Congress. It's in the public domain. It's going to look like it says 1895 this was filmed, but I heavily researched this, and it's absolutely actually filmed in 1894. And this is the only recording that exists of Annie, 21 seconds. You want to know why? Because Edison wanted to see if he could capture the smoke from her gun. Thank God he did this, but I would have loved to have seen some of the things she did. And there's no sound to it. They added those titles there, so. That's Frank Butler behind her. I know this isn't very clear. Look how close she was to him. But it's the only recording we have. So thank you, Thomas Edison. Anyway, I find that to be a really neat connection. This is Annie in 1896. So she's 36 years old. A different view of her. After the USS Maine sunk in 1898, which leads to the war, Spanish-American War, because some people believed that that was done deliberately by Spain. Other people believe it was just an accident. And then they had conflict over Cuba. So President William McKinley struggled for months trying to decide if the United States should declare war. Finally, on April 25th, Congress officially declared war on Spain in a battle for Cuba, beginning the Spanish-American War. And what I want to say to you about that is when Theodore Miller Edison, Mina's brother, thought that that would be a grand adventure, which many wealthy young men did at the time, and he died there. 3 weeks before war was declared, Annie Oakley wrote to President of the United States, McKinley, volunteering to organize a regiment of 50 female sharpshooters who would supply their own ammunition and arms should the nation go to war. And a request was turned down because women were not allowed to serve. The blue underlining the letter, do you see it right down here, indicates it was passed from the White House to the War Department. And they declined her offer. And this is Annie's stationery. And at the time, it was only 11 years with the show. And it tells all about her career and where she performed. And this is also in the public domain. I thought that was pretty amazing when she offered to do that. Now we're skipping ahead. That was like 1896 picture. Now we're up to 1907. On October 29th, 1901, two trains collided and derailed near Linwood, North Carolina. 5 cars of horses and other animals belonging to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show were killed or mortally wounded. Annie and Frank reported that Annie was so traumatized by the accident that her hair turned white within 17 hours. It was untrue. This is the other story, which I also find really hard to believe, but whatever, her hair turned white. She liked to visit an Arkansas hot springs resort. During one visit in late December 1902 or January 1901 or January 1902, Annie was forgotten by her attendant, and after 45 minutes, she fainted in her hot bath. And her hair turned white and her skin became speckled with brown spots. I know about speckling with brown spots from being out in the sun when I at work because of her need for privacy. I don't want to talk about it either. Annie and Frank never talked about the incident. So actually, nobody really knows what happened and why her hair all of a sudden turned white. And this is a picture that she had autographed. Now here's Annie. Now it's like, I'm not thinking very well here. But there she is with this dark curly hair, which you saw her hair was long and it was much lighter than this here. And some people claim that she wasn't in this accident or that it wasn't serious, but from what I've read, I believe it. And she was badly injured. She needed 5 spinal operations. She was temporarily paralyzed. It kind of ended her career as a sharpshooter. She does come back, but it's never the same. Well, she retired from the Wild West show and she tried acting again as the star of a show called The Western Girl, written for her, which opened in New Jersey, November 1902. So that would be 40 when she's 42 years old. She would also teach shooting at exclusive clubs. Now, remember, they give away a lot of their money, so they're not have tons of money stashed away. They never forget Annie's roots. Meanwhile, Frank worked for the Union Metallic Cartridge Company, which today is known as Remington, promoting its products to the increasing number of trap shooters. In 1910, Frank and Annie attended a Wild West show at Madison Square Garden. It was known as the Two Bill Show because Buffalo Bill's show had merged with a rival, Pawnee Bill. And I think Annie briefly also shot in the Pawnee Bill show, but not like she did with Buffalo Bill. Cody asked Annie to rejoin the show, but she and Frank turned him down. Instead, the following year, they joined with Vernon C. Seaver's Young Buffalo Wild West, and Annie continued to shoot for them till retiring for good in 1913. So that was for 3 years. And I don't know why she turned Buffalo Bill down. Maybe their schedule was more rigorous. Annie and Frank continued to be friends with Cody, though. And when Buffalo Bill died on January 10th, 1917, she wrote a glowing eulogy. So his hair, that is a wig, because they didn't want her white hair to show. I do like that picture of her in profile. On August 11th, 1903, 2 of her Chicago newspapers reported that a destitute Oakley had been arrested for stealing a pair of men's pants to pay for her cocaine addiction, though Annie had not been in Chicago since the previous winter. Newspapers around the country were printing this story. The truth was that the woman who was arrested was a burlesque dancer who was posing as Oakley, and she goes actually by the name Annie Oakley. Most papers printed retractions when Annie went after them because her reputation was important to her. But Annie vowed that someone will pay for this dreadful mistake, and she spent 6 years filing suit against 55 newspapers in the largest libel action the country had ever seen at that time. She won or settled 54 of those, including a judgment against Hearst for 27,000. But the time and energy and money it took, honestly, she did not come out ahead financially. But I believe she believed she had redeemed her reputation, which was like a really cruddy thing to have had to deal with. And this is a picture of her when she's demonstrating to women how to shoot. Now, Annie and Frank, when they started their act, they had Frank's dog that would travel with them. Can't remember his name, but this is her dog, Dave. And he also went hunting with her. So the United States enters World War I in 1917, and Oakley offered to raise a regiment of women volunteers to fight in the war. She had made the same offer during the Spanish-American War, and neither time was it accepted because women needed to know their roles. She also volunteered to teach marksmanship to the troops. Nope. And he volunteered for the National War Council on the Young Men's Christian Association, otherwise known as the YMCA, War Camp Community Service, and the Red Cross. And their dog that they had, and their dogs, I will say, probably were in some way like their children together. That might sound strange, but he was part of their life, part of their act. And Dave, their dog, became the Red Cross dog by sniffing out donations of cash and handkerchiefs, and people love that. And there's Dave right there. And look at this. Annie Oakley shooting an apple from dog Dave's head. My goodness, my dog barks if he sees a bird or hears strange noises. Dave, isn't Dave amazing? I can't imagine. And this is circa 1920 with their dog, Dave. It looks like some type of setter. When I was a little girl, I had a mixed breed that looked like a English setter. Interesting. Did you know that Annie was also a snowbird for a time? Later in her life, Annie spent winters in Lake County, Florida with Frank for at least a dozen years. Her time as a guest at Leesburg's Lakeview Hotel, and there's a picture of it on an old postcard, is now memorialized by a life-size statue behind the town library near where she spent the winter. And if you've ever been there, let me know. There she is, this little shore shot. Featured in the sculpture is her beloved friend, Dave the Wonder Dog. She might have spent the rest of her life in Florida had it not been for two terrible events near the Dixie Highway. So this is Dave, but I think they made Annie just a wee bit younger in the statue. I would love to see that. And there Annie is in 1922. And I didn't even tell you the terrible things that happened. Dave escaped, got outside, and was hit by a car, and he died, which broke both of their hearts and just crushed her. I feel so badly for her. While her husband lay critically ill in a Detroit hospital, funeral services were conducted here today. For the Annie Oakley world famous rifle shot, there was a complete lack of ostentation at the final rites. For complying with the wish of the departed, the services were severely brief and simple and were private. Only near relatives were in attendance. These included a brother, John Mosey, you can see the alternative spelling, and three sisters, Mrs. Bonnie Blakely, Mrs. Hilda Haynes, and Mrs. Irene Dayton. And following the obsequies, I don't know how to say that, the body was taken to Cincinnati where it will be cremated, which would have been also kind of unusual for that time. Later, the ashes will be placed in an urn and buried in the little cemetery near Brock, where Annie had purchased a plot of ground as her last resting place not long before she died. before her death, and Annie had been ill for a while. And she had pernicious anemia. Her will was arranged, and she purchased a lot in the cemetery. Why wasn't Frank there at her bedside? Well, Annie wanted him to be able to go to their home in North Carolina. And so that's where he headed, but he never made it. So he ended up in Michigan, where Annie ended up with her family in Ohio. And then eventually she was briefly in some type of home. So she dies, and then Frank dies 3 years later, which I found, I mean, not 3 years, 3 weeks later, which I found really very close together. The death here last night of Frank Butler, husband of the late Annie Oakley, the most famous markswoman and an exhibition shot of all time, ended one of the most perfect love stories that ever lived in America. His death came only 3 weeks after that of his wife, and relatives believe a broken heart hastened the end. For more than 50 years, Butler was his wife's manager. She was one of the pioneers in the field of careers for women. But before he met Annie Oakley, Butler was a well-known shot, but he often admitted his wife was better than he. Annie's greater fame never marred their happiness. It was a mutual partnership of the two. And so when they were their most ill, they weren't able to be together. I think Annie changed the future for women. Sharpshooting, marksmanship became more acceptable. Shooting for sport also came along because of her. And by the way, when I go back to them being in Florida, by the time their dog is killed, they just believe that it is not a good place to be. That things have gotten more run down at the hotel. I don't know if it's because of their broken hearts. And then Annie's health also was starting to decline at that point. And then they wouldn't go back to there after that year. Annie Oakley died on November 3rd, 1926. Frank Butler, whom she had been married for 50 years, died 18 days later, though he wasn't from Ohio. They were buried together. Annie Oakley, 1926, at rest. Frankie Butler, 1926, at rest. There's some of siblings buried next to her. That spelling is Moses, but if you go through the original spellings, there are many, and I wanted to show you a close-up. Wow. What an amazing woman she was. Ohio historical marker, Phoebe Ann Mosey, see it, not Moses there, known as Annie Oakley, was born 6 miles northeast of here in what was then Woodland, later renamed Willowdale. Born in 1860, she was the sixth daughter born to Jacob and Susan Mosey. Although after the death of her father, she engaged in shooting wild game to feed the Mosey family. The child prodigy shooter shot match after match until she won a life-changing match in 1881 with champion shooter Frank Butler. In 1882, Phoebe Ann married Butler in Windsor, Ontario. Just briefly, I want to tell you in popular culture how this influenced us. This is the first star, Ethel Merman, and she did have quite a stage presence, maybe a little brassy or personality. And look at the yellow outfit. I mean, that I will tell you that's not anything Annie would have worn, but even more so, this movie poster that has Betty Hutton. And it was originally supposed to be Judy Garland, but there was directors' problems with Judy, and Betty Hutton was loaned to them. She and the guy that plays Frank Butler, Howard Keel, they didn't get along. And if you look at the movie, she is a bleached blonde, which Annie certainly wasn't, and just really flat outfits that Annie never would have worn. Of course, it is nice to have, she became more popular in people's memory for a while because her story is being told, except it's really not much of her true story, except that they were shooters. Never talks about them shooting together, working together, that she misses a shot. In the last scene, she misses a shot to save her husband's ego, which she never would have done. In the late 90s, there's a revival of Annie Get Your Gun, and they do take some things out because there were some offensive things, especially the song about I'm an Indian too, a Sioux like you. Really, really offensive. So I don't know if they ever changed the end of the show, but I will let you know that this is the musical paints Frank as a Devo with a hot temper, and definitely in the 1946 and 1950. I think they toned it down a little for the late 90s when Bernadette Peters stars, and then this is Reba McEntire. And that there's a lot of famous songs that come out of there. Like there's no business like show business. You can't get a man with a gun. I won't comment on that one. And anything you can do, I can do better. But he's like a hot-tempered guy with an easily bruised ego. And none of this was true from the moment he and Annie met. Frank was supportive of Annie and he wanted to shine. I just will play you a few seconds of this.
Anything you can say, I can say.
I'll tell you who this is. After.
No, you can't. No, you can't. No, you can't. No, you can jump a hurdle.
You wear a girdle.
I can knit a sweater.
I can feel it better.
I can do most anything.
Can you bake a pie?
No.
Neither can I.
Anything you can sing, I can sing sweeter.
I can sing with me.
I thought that was enough. That is Reba McEntire, and that is Tom Wopat, who was on the Dukes of Hazzard. So this was in the late 90s. And here is some of the things I use for sources. I thank you for joining me. And if you have questions, Shaffer at EdisonFord.org or suggestions for a presentation, I would absolutely love it. And thank you so much for joining me.